My name is Cyrus and I am 43 years old. I worked as a nurse in Bangor for 11 years. Every shift left a paper trail behind. The care log never lied about who actually showed up. Julian stood by the metal filing cabinet in the corner. He tapped the steel drawer with his knuckle. "You are just the help around here," Julian said to me with a cold laugh. I stared at the chart on the clipboard. My hand stayed steady on the vinyl surface. The family rule always favored whoever shouted loudest about their sacrifices. Martha watched from the doorway with folded arms. She lived next door and knew how the household operated. "You should just let him handle everything today," Martha said to me in a low voice. I kept my eyes fixed on the ink strokes of the nursing entry. Vitals and timestamps remain completely honest before a single person in the room opens their mouth. Julian wanted the paperwork signed without delay. I reached for my pen and waited for the right moment. "Please stay for the remainder of this account. Keep your eyes on that old metal filing cabinet in the corner. Hit subscribe right now so you can see what papers rest inside its locked drawers. Leave a reply below with the name of your hometown. This is a quiet reckoning, never a shouting match across a crowded room. My nursing training taught me to observe every small detail without panic. The ledgers do not lie. We will uncover them step by step." For 11 years, my life ran on ink and hours. I carried the care log from room to room under my arm. Every shift demanded a precise entry. The clock ticked while I measured drops in a small glass cup. Nursing teaches a quiet sort of patience that normal people rarely understand. You learn to watch the steady rise of a fever chart before anyone else notices the flush in the skin. The family rule was simple. What was administered by steady hands belonged by public decree to whoever spoke loudest about sacrifice. Julian understood that rule better than anyone. He raised his voice while I wrote the numbers down. Ink does not argue with volume. A blue line on a chart stayed exactly where the pen left it, ignoring every loud claim made across the kitchen table. I trusted the margin notes far more than the conversations happening around me. Every timestamp proved when medicine left the bottle. The records stacked up inside the metal filing cabinet. The house operated on a principle that nobody ever questioned aloud. Inside these walls, ownership followed volume. If you spoke loudest about how much you gave, the room eventually handed the ledger over to you. It was a strange kind of logic. My mother used to nod along whenever this unwritten law was invoked by the kitchen windows. She believed that noisy sacrifice carried more weight than quiet consistency. I never believed it for a second. Nurse training teaches you to look past the noise and find the actual pulse, but this household ran differently. Authority belonged to whoever claimed it first with enough theater. Julian understood this rule better than anyone else in the family. He practiced it every morning before his boots even hit the floorboards. He would stand by the hallway mirror and practice his worried expression for the day ahead. Then he would march into the kitchen and announce his heavy burdens to whoever happened to be sitting there. Nobody checked his figures. Nobody asked to see receipts. His voice filled the space completely, pushing all other versions of reality out the door. I sat at the table and watched him perform this routine year after year. It was exhausting to witness, yet strangely predictable. Every family has its own peculiar gravity. Ours happened to pull toward the loudest mouth in the room. I kept my own counsel and maintained my own records in secret. While Julian talked about his sacrifices, I measured out the exact doses and logged the exact hours. My method lacked theatrical flair. It did not involve grand speeches or heavy sighs by the window. It just relied on ink and paper, staying faithful to reality. The trouble was that everyone else had lived under this roof for decades. They had memorized the rhythm of the performance long before I ever brought my medical charts into the house. They accepted Julian's version because it sounded more dramatic than the truth. A quiet nurse keeping track of drops and milligrams did not offer much entertainment value. Drama always wins when people want a simple story to believe in. So the rule remained intact, governing every interaction between us. Whatever was administered by steady hands belonged by public decree to whoever spoke loudest about sacrifice. Julian knew this better than anyone. He leaned into that advantage every single time a decision needed to be made about the household. He would raise his voice until the room surrendered its authority to him without a fight. I never argued back when he took charge of the paperwork. Arguing with a performance is like arguing with a cloud. You just wait for the wind to shift and keep your feet planted on solid ground. I stayed at my post and watched the dynamic play out without interfering. There was no point in shouting over a man who practiced his lines in the mirror. Instead, I let him have his stage while I kept my notes locked away safely in the corner. The family law governed them, but it never governed me. I knew that reality does not care who shouts the loudest when the final audit happens. Truth waits patiently in the margin notes. Julian arrived at 3 in the afternoon. He wore a heavy wool coat over his shoulders. Julian stepped across the threshold while carrying a worn leather briefcase that seemed far too heavy for a simple afternoon visit. Martha followed him closely through the open doorway. The hallway smelled of damp wool and cold cedar. Martha looked toward the hallway corner. An old metal filing cabinet stood there against the peeling wallpaper. Julian dropped his leather case onto the floor with a dull thud. He adjusted his heavy collar and checked his silver watch. He demanded attention immediately. Julian stood by the radiator and rubbed his cold hands together. He looked at me with tight eyes. We had known each other across 45 long years of shared history while living in this small coastal Maine town. He pointed a sharp finger toward the kitchen table. Martha leaned against the doorframe for physical support. Her palm rested on the wood. She looked tired and anxious. She wanted the noise to stop more than anything else in the world. She spoke in a quiet voice. "He's just resting. Let the boy handle the papers," she said. I kept my hands steady at my sides. A nurse learns to keep his pulse low in tense rooms. Julian paced across the worn wooden floorboards while complaining loudly about the long distance he had traveled across the county that morning. His heavy boots left wet tracks near the entrance. He talked about all the burdens he carried entirely alone. His voice echoed against the low ceiling. I watched him gesture toward the stack of forms on the counter. A mother's recipe card sat pinned beside those papers under a heavy magnet. It was written in faded blue ink from decades ago. It listed ingredients for bread, not legal demands. Martha shifted her weight and sighed softly. She looked down at the floorboards between us. She desperately wanted absolute peace in the house above all else, while dealing privately with her own painful failing joints. Her loyalty belonged to whoever spoke first and loudest in the room. Julian filled the silence with more complaints about his busy schedule. He talked about lost hours and missed opportunities. I did not interrupt him once during his speech. A professional observer lets the subject talk until the pattern emerges clearly. The room grew colder as the afternoon light faded outside. Julian picked up a blue pen from the tray. He tapped the barrel against his open palm. He desperately wanted a formal signature placed on the dotted line right then before the afternoon light completely failed. 11 years of clinical routines taught me to wait out a performance. You watch the hands, not the mouth. You note the exact time a person starts sweating under bright lights. Julian leaned closer and pushed the papers across the grain. He told me it was time to finish the tedious task today. Martha nodded along with every single word Julian spoke. She believed the theater of exhaustion completely. She slowly reached out and gently touched the worn corner of the wooden table while carefully steadying her troubled breathing. Her knuckles were swollen with age. She murmured agreement under her breath. She thought compliance would quiet the arguments. She did not know what sat inside the locked drawers behind me. I stood silently and checked my watch against the wall clock. The minute hand ticked forward without any rush. The kitchen grew dim as clouds covered the afternoon sun. Julian cleared his throat and stepped closer to the counter. He loudly demanded an immediate practical answer before the long evening nursing shift officially began downtown at the local hospital. I looked past him toward the hallway corner again. The metal cabinet remained locked and silent. Every single clinical shift required documentation down to the final drop. This house operated on a different kind of record entirely. I kept my pen resting quietly in my pocket. Silence filled the room. Shadows lengthened across the floor. This quiet professional patience remained the only tool I required while waiting for the truth to surface. Julian slammed his palm against the counter. The surface rattled. "You need to sign these forms right now," Julian said. His voice echoed off the cheap paneling of the old coastal kitchen. I stared down at the blue ink waiting on the page. Martha shifted her feet near the doorway. She gripped the wooden handle of her cane very tightly. Julian adjusted his cuffs with a sharp, impatient twitch. He always acted like he owned the entire county. The afternoon light cut sideways across the worn linoleum floor, while the old wall clock ticked away its seconds with a relentless rhythm. "This family runs on what people can see," Julian said. He tapped a greasy finger against the stacked papers. I kept my fingers flat against the wooden table. My blue pen stayed poised above the margin lines. Martha sighed softly and looked away from us. She did not want any trouble in the hallway. Everyone knew how the household rules worked around here. The loudest voice always claimed the prize at the end of the day, without ever looking at a single actual receipt. "You are just being stubborn about this," Julian shouted. He leaned across the narrow gap between us. "Just put your name on the dotted line," Julian said. I remained completely still in my chair. My 11 years of shift work had taught me a quiet lesson. Vitals and timestamps tell the truth before anyone in the room does. Julian hated when I refused to rush because he expected instant obedience from everyone he cornered in that cramped coastal kitchen. He wanted compliance without any written trail. Martha cleared her throat in the doorway. She looked down at her swollen knuckles with deep regret. "It might be easier if you just agree," Martha said. Her voice shook slightly against the wood trim. Julian smiled a thin and bitter smile while he waited for me to yield under his heavy pressure. He thought he had already won the argument. I gripped my pen a little tighter. The metal filing cabinet sat silently down the hall, holding all my meticulous records. "Nobody cares about your charts," Julian muttered. He picked up a ceramic mug from the counter. "You are wasting everyone's time with your books." I did not blink behind my glasses. My professional nursing training kept my pulse entirely normal through every single manufactured crisis that Julian brought to the house. The paper on the desk remained unsigned. Julian dropped the mug back onto the wood with a loud crack that echoed through the kitchen. The silence stretched thin between us. Martha turned her face away toward the garden outside. Julian let out a sharp breath through his teeth. He realized the pen was still not moving. Decades of working inside busy Bangor emergency rooms trained me for much worse than this kind of theatrical family display. A shouting man with a briefcase was nothing special at all. I watched the ink dry on the nib. "You will regret this choice," Julian muttered. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the chair seat. "I am done talking to you," Julian said. He turned and marched toward the front door. Martha shuffled slowly after him into the cool twilight air while I remained completely still at the wooden table. The locked metal drawers waited down the hall, guarding the truth of every shift. No one spoke as the front door clicked shut. The heavy quiet returned to the coastal house. I picked up my vinyl clipboard with steady fingers while the long evening shadows lengthened across the quiet room. The care log rested underneath my palm. Every recorded hour stood ready for the future. Time would prove every single ink mark true without requiring a single raised voice from my corner. The kitchen grew very quiet after Julian left the room. I stayed at the table. My pen rested beside the open binder. Every shift required attention to detail and steady hands. Nothing more was said about the paperwork that afternoon. Silence settled into the corners of the house. I gathered my things from the counter. A quiet withdrawal began right then. There was no argument to be had. Arguing changed nothing in this household. I walked across the wooden floorboards toward the corner. An old metal filing cabinet stood against the pale wall. It held years of records and shift notes. The top drawer slid open with a familiar metallic scrape. I placed my spare pens inside the metal box. Then came my extra notebooks and a small stack of receipts. This piece of office furniture became my new repository. Things that mattered went into those drawers now. No one else ever checked inside that specific container. It was safe enough for everyday items. Martha remained in the front room. She sat quietly with her ceramic mug. A silver spoon tapped the side of the glazed clay. She did not look up when I walked past her. People in Bangor knew how to look away from trouble. She understood the rules of the Vance home just as well as I did. Survival here meant noticing nothing at all. I did not disturb her rest. My focus stayed entirely on the task at hand. Opening the middle drawer required a firm pull. I set a bundle of personal letters inside the dark recess. These papers belonged nowhere near the kitchen table. Julian liked to rifle through loose mail. He assumed every surface in the house belonged exclusively to him. That assumption made life predictable. Predictability helped me plan my next steps carefully. I closed the drawer until it latched securely. The sound was faint and muffled. My nursing bag sat near the back door. I picked it up by the worn leather handle. Carrying it to the corner felt like a small act of reclamation. Bangor winters demanded practical habits. Keeping tools organized kept the mind sharp during long shifts. I slid the bag onto the lower shelf of the cabinet. It fit snugly behind a stack of old medical manuals. Nobody else would think to look there. Julian came back inside around 5 o'clock. He hung his heavy jacket on the wooden peg by the door. His boots tracked dry mud across the braided rug. He glanced at the table and grunted. The clean space annoyed him slightly. He wanted something to complain about. I did not look up from my sorting. My hands moved steadily among the paper clips and rubber bands. I am 43 years old, and I know how to make myself invisible. "Where are the delivery receipts?" Julian asked from the doorway. "They stay right here now," I said. He narrowed his eyes at the metal unit. A brief frown crossed his heavy features. He did not press the matter further tonight. His loud speeches required an active audience. Without an argument, his energy flagged quickly. He walked past me toward the pantry instead. The refrigerator door opened with a loud suction pop. He grabbed a bottle of soda and slammed the door shut again. Exile has its own quiet rhythm. Days passed without a single raised voice in the hallway. I kept to my routine with absolute precision. Every patient visit was logged down to the minute. My charts remained spotless and accurate. Vitals and timestamps tell the truth before anyone in the room does. That professional creed guided every action I took. The filing cabinet grew heavier with each passing week. Locked drawers kept my private world separate from their chaos. Martha watched me from the doorway one morning. Her hands rested over the handle of her ceramic mug. She took a slow sip of her lukewarm tea. "You keep that cabinet locked tight these days," she said. "It is better that way," I said. She nodded once and stared down at the floorboards. Her silence was the closest thing to support this house ever offered. I turned back to my ledgers. The ink dried black and neat against the white margin. Outside the window, gray clouds drifted over the Bangor rooftops. Another shift was coming soon. I reached for my pen and waited for the clock to change. "You are still listening. I appreciate that. You know how it feels when someone quietly rearranges your desk while you stand outside the door. Have you ever watched someone take inventory of a life they did not build? If you have stood by while others claimed what took years to measure, drop a note below. I read them all. Stay close with me here. Before this winter breaks in Bangor, every single entry written in those hidden pages will see the light." The hallway stayed cold. The metal filing cabinet rested against the plaster wall. I opened the bottom drawer with a small brass key. Inside, blue folders grew thicker. Month followed month. Winter frost gave way to spring mud. I added new pages to the stack. Every shift generated fresh entries. A nurse relies on precise ink. Numbers leave no room for argument. Julian walked past the door often. He carried bundles of invoices under his arm. He talked loudly about market rates. He shouted down the stairs to Martha. Martha stayed in the front room with her ceramic mug. She stirred her tea with the silver spoon. She never looked at my corner. The filing cabinet swallowed the truth drop by drop. I measured out liquid drops in small glass cups. I wrote down exact times in the margins. Morning sun cut across the floorboards. Dust motes turned in the thin beam. I kept my own counsel. The cabinet drawer clicked shut with a metallic bite. No one else knew what lived inside those folders. The pages mounted higher. 2 years dissolved into 3. The ink dried black on cheap lined paper. Julian assumed the house belonged to his voice alone. He signed papers at the kitchen table. He used thick strokes with a black fountain pen. He never checked the back pages. He never asked about the running totals. I turned the page. The pen moved without hesitation. Every pulse rate found a home on the grid. Every temperature spike was mapped in red ink. The house creaked under the weight of old lumber. The floorboards groaned beneath heavy boots. Julian slammed the pantry door on Tuesdays. The sound rattled the tea tins on the high shelf. Martha adjusted her shawl. She stared into her brown-glazed mug. The silver spoon tapped the ceramic rim. Clink, clink, clink. It was a rhythmic Bangor morning. Nothing changed in the kitchen. The big table remained piled with lumber receipts. Julian stacked them in neat piles. He believed order came from volume. He believed shouting made a contract binding. I closed the current ledger. I slid it into the lower compartment. I locked the steel latch. The mechanism engaged with a dull thud. Outside, snow began to fall against the window panes. Winter returned to Maine. The cold settled deep into the foundation. I pulled out a fresh book. The first line required a date. I wrote it down. The minute hand ticked forward. Each season brought its own routine. A nurse watches changes in posture and breath. People think they hide their decline. The physical record tells a different story. Every drop of medicine was accounted for. Every missed hour was marked in red. Julian cared only for the cash drawer. He tallied receipts while ignoring the actual care. His paperwork was loud and messy. Mine was quiet and exact. Time accumulated inside the metal container. The stack of logs grew tall. Dust settled on the top shelf. I wiped it clean every Sunday morning. The routine became a private shield. No one questioned the quiet man in the hall. They assumed my silence meant defeat. They were mistaken. Every timestamp remained secure under lock and key. Spring rain battered the cedar shingles. Water leaked through the old flashing above the back door. Julian complained about the cost of repairs. He brought home more receipts in cardboard boxes. I filed them by date. The sequence mattered more than his shouting. Each month brought the same predictable rhythm. Martha grew slower on her feet. She leaned heavily on the walnut sideboard when crossing the hall. Her silver spoon struck her ceramic mug with a duller sound now. Clink. I noticed the change in her grip. A nurse sees what others ignore. I wrote the observation down in a narrow margin. July heat settled over Bangor like a damp wool blanket. The windows stayed open to catch the breeze. Julian argued with a timber broker by the back fence. His voice carried through the screen door. He demanded a higher price for maple logs. The broker shook his head and walked away. Julian slammed his fist against the porch railing. He cursed the local economy. He believed force could bend a market. The ledger pages absorbed the noise without a shudder. August faded into September. The maple leaves turned red and fell in heaps across the lawn. I swept the steps each morning. My broom made a dry scraping sound against the concrete. Julian stepped over the leaves without looking down. He carried a fresh stack of blue folders to the pantry. He dumped them on top of the old ones. The shelf groaned under the weight. November arrived with freezing rain. The roads turned to slush. I pulled my coat tight against the wind. The filing cabinet waited in the dark corridor. I turned the brass key in the lock. The steel mechanism slid back smoothly. I opened the middle drawer. More than 3 years had passed since the shift logs began. The stack reached halfway to the top of the metal frame. I pulled out a fresh pad of lined paper. I wrote the current date at the top. Year 4 began with a stroke of blue ink. Julian shouted an order to Martha from the kitchen. She did not answer him right away. She sat quietly with her tea. The ceramic mug stayed cold between her palms. I dipped my pen into the well. Every breath had a number. Every pulse had a coordinate in time. The house could rot from the inside out for all Julian cared. He only watched the cash flow. He signed his name with sweeping flourishes on every new contract. His pen nib scratched angrily against the paper. Mine moved softly. Consistent pressure. Clean lines. No emotion attached to the ink. The winter snows piled high against the foundation. The cold Bangor air crept through the window frames. I logged the morning temperatures. I logged the medication amounts. Nothing escaped the grid. The cabinet swallowed the years quietly. Each evening brought the same dim light through the narrow hall window. I sat at the small wooden desk. The lamp cast a sharp circle over the paper. My fingers were steady. Years of hospital shifts trained the muscle memory. A misplaced decimal could cost a life. A falsified record could destroy an inquiry. Julian understood none of this. He treated paper like currency. He stacked invoices to prove his worth. He believed volume equaled truth. The steel drawers held a different standard entirely. Every entry was verified by touch and sight. The small glass medicine cups sat in a row on the shelf. They were washed and dried twice daily. Martha walked past the desk on her way to bed. She paused once and looked at my hands. Her eyes were cloudy with age. She said nothing about the ledgers. She only pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. Then she continued down the dark hallway. I listened to her footsteps fade. The house settled into its nightly creak. Bangor winter nights had a specific silence. I turned another page in the book. The ink soaked into the grain. The kitchen table in Bangor held a stack of unopened utility bills. Julian sat in the wooden chair by the window. His usual theatrical posture was gone completely. He rubbed his tired eyes with the back of a calloused hand. I watched him from the doorway while holding my blue nursing clipboard. He looked older than 45 years in the afternoon light. He reached for a ceramic mug that had gone completely cold hours ago. He forgot where he placed his reading glasses on the cluttered counter. These little lapses happened more often during the past 4 weeks. He muttered something under his breath about the rising cost of fuel. For 11 years, I had watched people face exhaustion inside hospital rooms. Julian was simply cracking beneath the quiet pressure of his own unverified claims. He dropped his silver pocket watch onto the laminate surface with a dull clatter. The crystal face was cracked right across the center like a spiderweb. He picked it up and traced the fracture with a trembling thumb. He looked less formidable in that posture than he wanted anyone to know. A strange sort of fatigue softened the sharp lines around his mouth. He smoothed down his wrinkled collar with a jerky, distracted motion. I stepped closer to the table without making a sound on the linoleum floor. He did not look up from the broken metal of his timepiece. My father used to carry a watch very much like that one during winter. Julian sighed and set the broken glass down beside a forgotten envelope. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, where a deep red dent remained. He looked remarkably human for a man who claimed absolute authority over every room. The performance was slipping away because the numbers refused to match his stories. He cleared his throat and looked out at the gray backyard through the pane. "We need to settle these accounts before the weekend arrives," he said quietly. I kept my fingers steady against the cold vinyl of my clipboard. The ledger in the metal cabinet recorded every single discrepancy down to the last penny. Julian reached into his coat pocket for a clean handkerchief to wipe the dust. He unfolded the fabric slowly and wiped the moisture from his glasses. His fingers shook slightly while he cleaned the thin wire frames. I remembered the exact phrase he used to repeat whenever someone questioned his authority here. He looked at the window and muttered his usual defense without any real heat behind it. "He is just resting. Let the boy handle the papers," he said to nobody in particular. The old phrase echoed through the quiet kitchen with a hollow sound. It carried a different weight now that the physical reality had finally shifted. For 4 years, those words served as an impenetrable shield against any outside inspection. Now they sounded like a worn-out excuse spoken by a tired, middle-aged man. I did not remind him of the actual medical timeline recorded in my blue logbooks. Vitals and timestamps tell the truth before anyone in the room does, as my training taught me. Julian set his glasses on the table and massaged his aching shoulder joints. He looked at the unopened envelopes with a sudden, genuine expression of defeat. The administrative burden was finally crushing the flimsy structure of his entire deception. He had spent 11 years convincing Bangor neighbors that he carried the family burden alone. The ledger pages inside the locked filing cabinet told a much simpler story of neglect. Every missed medication dose and every delayed pharmacy delivery was documented in black ink. He sighed again and stared blankly at the faded blue recipe card on the wall. That recipe card had hung there since my mother managed the household affairs before her illness. Julian reached out a hand and touched the edge of the yellowed paper gently. His posture slumped further until his shoulders curved inward toward his chest. For one brief moment, he was just a weary man trapped by his own loud mouth. I stood entirely still and waited for him to notice my steady presence. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if the recipe card had burned his fingers. He cleared his throat and tried to pull his old theatrical posture back into place. The attempt failed because the exhaustion ran too deep into his bones by now. He picked up his cold ceramic mug and stared into the dark liquid inside. "We cannot keep pretending the ledgers balance themselves out," I said to him quietly. He stiffened at my words and finally raised his eyes to meet my gaze. The silence between us stretched out across the room while the kitchen clock ticked steadily. He knew the numbers in the hidden drawer were completely accurate down to the minute. He opened his mouth to launch into another loud defense about all his sacrifices. Then he stopped himself because the energy for shouting had completely drained away. He closed his mouth and simply nodded once toward the stack of unpaid utility bills. I did not gloat or offer any comforting words to ease his obvious discomfort. Professional nursing requires a calm detachment when observing a patient finally facing reality. Julian pushed the stack of papers across the wooden table toward my nursing clipboard. The crack in the family facade was widening every single day Julian sat in that kitchen. I picked up my blue pen and prepared to document the exact time of this conversation. "You are still here with me. I appreciate that. Think about this kitchen in Bangor as winter turns. Have you ever watched someone spend years building a life out of loud claims, only to watch it crack? When the ledger finally balances itself without your anger, do you step in to steady the falling walls, or do you simply stand back and let the math do its work? Tell me honestly. What would you do when the numbers finally speak?" The paper landed squarely on the kitchen table. Julian dropped it there with a heavy thud. It was a signed agreement bearing his sharp signature at the bottom corner. The document outlined a complete transfer of the timber rights. He laid it flat with his palm. He wanted immediate endorsement from everyone in the house. The ink was barely dry on the page. It smelled of cheap printer toner and fresh wood pulp from the mill down the road. Every single line of the text spelled out his overreach in plain black ink. "Sign your name right here," Julian said. His voice carried the booming confidence of a man who believed the rules bent entirely to his will. I looked down at the paper. The date stamped at the top matched a Tuesday from 2 weeks ago. That specific Tuesday held a very distinct place in my personal records. I kept my hands folded neatly inside my pockets. A nurse learns to recognize when a patient is signing away their senses under pressure. This was not a medical chart. This was a legal trap of his own making. Martha sat near the stove with her cold tea. She did not look at the document. Instead, she gazed fixedly at the wooden table's service grain. She muttered her familiar excuse without raising her eyes. That phrase had echoed through these rooms for years. It was the excuse used whenever responsibility needed to be shifted to someone louder. Julian tapped his heavy silver watch against the edge of the surface. He wanted an answer right now. I walked over to the dark hallway. An aged steel document organizer rested silently beside the flowered wall covering. I pulled the small brass key from my pocket. The lock turned with a smooth, familiar click that echoed in the quiet corridor. I reached inside for the second blue notebook. The care log rested right beneath it. Every entry inside those pages was dated down to the exact minute. Vitals and timestamps recorded every event with absolute precision. No argument could alter a timestamp written in black ink years ago. I carried the blue notebook back into the kitchen. I placed it beside the signed agreement on the oak table. Julian frowned at the sight of the worn cover. He thought my books were just idle nursing notes. He did not know what was contained within those lined pages. I opened the log to the exact page matching his date. The ink there told a completely different story about who was in the house that afternoon. A nurse knows how to read between the lines of a poorly kept chart. "You signed this on Tuesday," I said. My voice remained entirely level. The document stated he was managing the estate during an absence that never actually occurred on the calendar. Julian blinked hard at the open page. His pen had trapped him in a clumsy contradiction. The dates did not align with the reality recorded in the log. Martha finally lifted her head from the cold ceramic mug. She looked at the signature and then at the medical timestamps. The silence in the kitchen grew very heavy indeed, pressing down on the floorboards with unmistakable weight. I avoided raising my voice to lecture him. Revenge does not require shouting or dramatic threats in a domestic dispute. The written paper spoke for itself without any outside help from me. Julian pulled his hand back from the wooden surface. He stared at the contradiction staring up at him from the grain. His overreach was complete and total on paper. The record was undeniable, and the answers were sitting right there in front of everyone in the room. "We still have bills to pay tomorrow," Julian muttered defensively. He tried to brush the discrepancy aside with a quick wave of his hand. I stood completely still by the stove. I locked the blue notebook back inside the metal cabinet before returning to the room. The quiet record remained unbroken and steady against every claim he made throughout the bitter winter months. The kitchen light flickered once against the peeling wallpaper. Winter afternoon was fading fast outside the frosted window glass. Nobody moved an inch across the floorboards. The house held its breath while the evidence rested between us on the timber surface. The folding tables stretched across the worn wooden floor of the parish hall. I carefully aligned the 3 thick logbooks side by side under the dim brass fixtures. The room smelled of old hymnals, and damp wool coats hung near the radiator by the entry. Dust motes floated lazily through the shaft of pale winter light, cutting across the empty pews. Every page carried 11 years of precise entries, documenting every shift and every medical dose administered without a missing timestamp. Martha pushed the heavy oak door open slowly against the drift of snow outside. She walked with a slight limp toward the front row of folding chairs near the altar rail. She placed a small ceramic mug near the border of the mahogany table. The bitter winter wind outside rattled the tall stained glass windows, while she slowly lowered her frail frame onto the nearest wooden chair. She looked at the columns of numbers with tired eyes, saying nothing for a long moment. "You brought all the actual records here," Martha said. Her voice sounded thin against the high wooden ceiling of the old building. I nodded once in response to her quiet observation. She reached into her wool coat pocket and laid a folded paper envelope on the table. It was the missing pharmacy invoice from the winter of 2012. Even when the loud kitchen arguments grew too difficult to bear, she always remembered precisely where the duplicate receipts were hidden away. She smoothed the crease with a trembling thumb. The heavy oak door swung open again, with a sharp crack against the interior wall. Julian strode into the parish hall wearing his heavy silver watch and a familiar scowl. He carried a fresh stack of blue folders under his arm like a shield against harsh reality. He stopped 3 paces from the front table, breathing heavily from the cold walk from the truck. The heavy metal buttons on his dark wool coat caught the flat light falling through the tall, frosted windows of the hall. "You cannot solve anything by hauling old books out to the parish hall," Julian said. He dropped his blue folders onto the wood with an echoing thud. I did not flinch at the sudden noise or break my posture. Vitals and timestamps tell the truth before anyone in the room does. I placed my open palm flat against the paper page of the ledger. He tried to dismiss the entire pile as meaningless paperwork brought by someone who did not understand the family business. Julian stared down at the ink columns with narrowed eyes. "Look at the February totals for yourself," I said. My voice remained entirely steady in the cold room. Julian reached out a hesitant hand to touch the top leather ledger. His fingers paused just above the margin notes written in red ink. Every single numerical entry recorded across these thick volumes stood as a permanent witness to years of systematic financial overreach. The silence between us stretched longer than the winter shadows creeping across the worn oak floorboards. The final audit had finally begun inside the quiet hall, where no loud speeches could ever alter the permanent ink now. The folding tables stretched across the worn wooden floor of the parish hall. I carefully aligned the 3 thick logbooks side by side under the dim brass fixtures. The room smelled of old hymnals, and damp wool coats hung near the radiator by the entry. Dust motes floated lazily through the shaft of pale winter light, cutting across the empty pews. Every page carried 11 years of precise entries, documenting every shift and every medical dose administered without a missing timestamp. Martha pushed the heavy oak door open slowly against the drift of snow outside. She walked with a slight limp toward the front row of folding chairs near the altar rail. She placed a small pottery cup near the border of the mahogany table. The bitter winter wind outside rattled the tall stained glass windows, while she slowly lowered her frail frame onto the nearest wooden chair. She looked at the columns of numbers with tired eyes, saying nothing for a long moment. "You brought all the actual records here," Martha said. Her voice sounded thin against the high wooden ceiling of the old building. I nodded once in response to her quiet observation. She reached into her wool coat pocket and laid a folded paper envelope on the table. It was the missing pharmacy invoice from the winter of 2012. Even when the loud kitchen arguments grew too difficult to bear, she always remembered precisely where the duplicate receipts were hidden away. She smoothed the crease with a trembling thumb. The heavy oak door swung open again, with a sharp crack against the interior wall. Julian strode into the parish hall wearing his heavy silver watch and a familiar scowl. He carried a fresh stack of blue folders under his arm like a shield against harsh reality. He stopped 3 paces from the front table, breathing heavily from the cold walk from the truck. The heavy metal buttons on his dark wool coat caught the flat light falling through the tall, frosted windows of the hall. "You cannot solve anything by hauling old books out to the parish hall," Julian said. He dropped his blue folders onto the wood with an echoing thud. I did not flinch at the sudden noise or break my posture. Vitals and timestamps tell the truth before anyone in the room does. I placed my open palm flat against the paper page of the ledger. He tried to dismiss the entire pile as meaningless paperwork brought by someone who did not understand the family business. Julian stared down at the ink columns with narrowed eyes. "Look at the February totals for yourself," I said. My voice remained entirely steady in the cold room. Julian reached out a hesitant hand to touch the top leather ledger. His fingers paused just above the margin notes written in red ink. Every single numerical entry recorded across these thick volumes stood as a permanent witness to years of systematic financial overreach. The silence between us stretched longer than the winter shadows creeping across the worn oak floorboards. The final audit had finally begun inside the quiet hall, where no loud speeches could ever alter the permanent ink now. Julian stared hard at the endless rows of figures, showing where funds had vanished into private accounts over many long winters. His thick fingers hovered above the red ink margin notes. Martha adjusted her heavy wool shawl against the cold draft. "You took more than your share," she said softly. Her voice lacked all its former hesitation. Keeping her gaze averted from her nephew, she delivered those simple words inside the empty hall. The blue folders slipped from his heavy grip onto the bare wooden floor. He had no defense left against 11 years of meticulous tracking. The metal filing cabinet keys rested safely inside my deep coat pocket. I reached slowly into my worn leather bag for the small wooden container holding the final pieces of verified proof. "This audit requires no further debate," I said to him. Julian backed away toward the heavy oak doors without another single word. The bitter winter wind whistled loudly through the cold gaps in the old timber frame during the quiet afternoon hours. Martha remained seated by the table with her empty ceramic mug. We had reached the absolute end of the long accounting process. The ledgers remained open on the worn wood for anyone to inspect without fear. The church hall emptied into the freezing snow. Julian stood by the radiator. His hands shook inside his wool coat. I possessed the exact legal documents that were required to dismantle his entire financial standing before the end of the week. He expected a devastating final blow. People like him always expect identical measures of cruelty in return. I closed the metal box instead. Seeking total retribution required a constant investment of bitter energy that I simply refused to spend on him. Punishing Julian further would have meant keeping my personal life chained to his daily failures for another 10 miserable years. That price was far too high. My hospital night shifts provided all the heavy labor I cared to manage. Martha walked past us toward the exit. She paused near the heavy oak door. Her silver spoon rattled inside a small ceramic mug that she still carried through the bitter cold night air. She avoided making eye contact with both of us. Her silence carried a heavy weight through the room. I decided to let the entire matter drop completely because dragging it out further would serve no healthy purpose. Julian looked smaller under the harsh lights. He offered no further argument against the facts. The bitter Bangor winters tested every single resident eventually, without requiring any extra malice coming directly from my direction. My records stayed where they belonged on the shelf. The absolute truth regarding every single financial transaction was documented clearly in black ink across the heavy pages inside the drawer. Nothing else needed to be spoken aloud in that cold room. The hallway floorboards creaked beneath my boots. Silence settled over the corridor. Walking away quietly felt vastly superior to securing an empty public victory in front of completely indifferent strangers. The metal filing cabinet waited by the stairs. My yellow metal security key rotated effortlessly within the tumbler. The coming morning sun would inevitably bring another ordinary nursing shift located directly inside the busy regional hospital wards. No dramatic speeches echoed through the house. The arguments finally ended for good. Thoughtful personal restraint remained the only professional standard truly worth maintaining through all the most difficult seasons of life. Julian watched me from the shadows. He took erratic and barely perceptible breaths, letting go of the lingering household grudge, ultimately provided a completely unexpected sense of profound and lasting personal relief. The old clock ticked against the wall. Time moved forward without our permission. Carrying around that kind of bitter anger required far too much ongoing daily upkeep for any sensible working person. The front door closed with a soft click. Winter winds whistled around the corners. Quiet peace finally settled directly into the narrow space where loud conflict used to live every single day. My jacket hung on the peg. The house finally felt like a place to sleep. Strict professional boundaries successfully kept all the messy and complicated household chaos safely outside, where it all ultimately belonged. Tomorrow brought another shift at work. Patients needed steady hands and accurate notes. The troubled family past simply remained safely sealed up inside those cold metal office drawers for the rest of time. I turned off the overhead light. Darkness filled the small hallway completely. Choosing quiet personal restraint proved to be its own remarkably steady reward at the very end of all things. The work was done. Morning would come soon. Every single patient vital sign was properly checked and carefully verified long before the pale winter morning light finally arrived. The kitchen on Logan Street felt entirely different in the morning daylight. Martha sat quietly by the front window with her ceramic mug, while her tired hands rested peacefully on the floral tablecloth. She no longer needed to keep the peace between competing voices in the room. She reached into her knitting bag and pulled out the small wooden spool she had borrowed months ago. She placed it neatly on the wooden counter. It was a tiny gesture of absolute honesty. The small redemption landed quietly in the empty space. No grand apologies were offered or expected by anyone present. The morning sun illuminated the clean linoleum floor without harsh glare. I walked over to the hallway corner. The old metal filing cabinet remained closed and locked. The brass key sat safely in my pocket where it belonged. 11 years of meticulous nursing logs rested securely inside the heavy metal drawers away from any possibility of accidental damage. Every single shift was documented with absolute precision. Every temperature reading and medication dose stayed secured away from prying eyes. The hospital shift started later that afternoon. I felt a steady calm settling deep into my bones. No loud arguments echoed through the hallway anymore. The quiet rooms breathed easily. I turned back toward the kitchen counter. A faded blue index card rested beside the toaster. It was my mother's recipe card for lemon bread, written in her hurried cursive decades ago. Martha must have found it behind the flour canister during her quiet cleanup. The recipe card carried grease spots and flour smudges from years of baking. It was the precious legacy artifact I genuinely thought was lost forever during the long and chaotic winter months. I picked it up with clean fingers and traced the familiar handwriting with care. The ink had faded to a pale lavender shade over time. My mother always measured ingredients with exact pinches rather than digital scales. I set the recipe card gently back down on the wooden surface. It simply belonged to the quiet and ordinary life that remained safely after the audit ended in the parish hall. I walked to the coat rack and slipped my arms into my heavy wool jacket. The nursing bag waited by the front door. The street outside was quiet and ordinary. Snow melted slowly along the edges of the cedar fence. The steady Bangor residents carefully shoveled their snowy walkways without ever shouting or rushing through the cold morning air. I walked down the steps toward the hospital parking lot. My Bangor nursing badge clicked softly against my shirt pocket. The record stayed locked inside. You might wonder what remains after the ledgers close for good. On the small wooden table, my mother's recipe card sat beside an empty ceramic mug. It showed faded handwriting detailing a simple bread formula written decades ago by steady hands that knew every measurement by heart. Some battles end without a single raised voice or a destructive legal blow. I left the blue pen resting squarely on the wooden counter. Turning away from the empty space where the tall metal cabinet once stood, I walked down the narrow hallway toward the front exit. The brass key stayed behind on the wooden wall hook near the frame. Pushing the heavy panel outward, I stepped out into the sharp evening air. The front door eased shut behind me with a quiet click. Cold wind swept across the gravel lot as I walked away into the dark Bangor night without looking back. Leaving the quiet house behind took far less effort than carrying all those unnecessary burdens through the long and bitter winter months.